That's the one you cut or you split. So count it again, making sure you're counting correctly. Count. Go to the calm down chair and sit. There's nothing that infuriates me more than when you don't do what's on your paper. Somebody come up and show me how she should have counted to get her answer that was 1 and a split. Show my friends and teach them.
1 and a split.
Thank you. Do not go back to your seat and show me one thing and then don't do it here. You're confusing everybody. Very upset and very disappointed.
I'm Hirsch, and this is EdCast, a program created and produced by educators for everyone interested in education. The New York Times recently posted this viral video of a first-grade teacher in a Success Academy charter school. It received over 1,000 responses. Many condemned the harsh practices on display, while others defended both the teacher and the methods she used. While we may never know if this video is typical of a Success Academy class, it raises the broader question of what constitutes good teaching. My guests today are experts in early childhood education. They join me to discuss which teaching practices and environments produce the greatest student learning. Joining me today are Harriet Fayne, Dean of the Lehman College School of Education, and Carmen Brown, Professor of Early Childhood Education at CUNY's Hunter College. Welcome to EdCast, and thank you for joining us. We opened up our program by running the very controversial Success Academy video of a first grade teacher. Can I ask you, when you saw that video, what your reactions were to it? Carmen, let me start with you. What was your reaction?
Well, my first reaction was the type of environment that the teacher was creating. When you first look at how children can be successful, you really want to make sure that they have an environment that is conducive to learning, that's going to maximize their opportunities to learn. And when I first saw the video and how the children were sitting and how the teacher's tone and her directives and her reactions to the students, I felt sad for the students because I didn't feel like that was an appropriate atmosphere to maximize their learning.
What about you? What was your response?
My first response was that it was a perfect example of the no excuse philosophy gone bad. It resonated with a philosophy that essentially was the beginning of the no excuse philosophy, which is an approach called warm demander, warm demander approach to teaching. And I think back to the literature on warm demanders, and I remember some case scenarios where teachers essentially were very strict, very exacting around following directions to the T, and were quite harsh sometimes and direct in terms of feedback when a child didn't comply.
I want to get to the no excuses philosophy in depth in just a moment. I do want to just interrupt for 1 minute just to tell our viewers, when we talk about the no excuses philosophy, that is a philosophy that believes that being strict, that there should be certain things in place, that discipline is a foundation for learning for certain children. And so the no excuses part comes from just because they're poor or just because they're minority is not an excuse for not doing well. So with that in mind, so taking a look again at that no excuses behavior, and based on what you said, Carmen, what do you think that, before we even get into an in-depth look at that, what do parents and teachers need to know about how children learn? How do they learn best? I mean, what's your take on that?
I don't I don't feel like I have the answer to your question.
Okay.
Again, I think there are social and political contexts in which learning takes place. So again, what I found jarring about this video was a young white teacher disciplining a young black child in a very harsh way. I'm thinking that the warm demander philosophy works better when there's a cultural match between who the teacher is and who the child is. When there's a mismatch, there's the likelihood that things will go awry.
Now, you know, there were over 1,000 responses to that video. Some, of course, were very critical, and others said that this really was a good approach. And I want to ask you, based on what Dean Fayne has said about this idea of culture and the teacher and the culture, what was your take on it?
Well, you have to think of children's learning as a holistic approach. You need to look at their socio-emotional, understanding where they come from, understanding their culture, understanding what their values are. And again, teachers who are coming from suburban areas with this idealistic view of teaching and really thinking that, and for lack of a better word, thinking they can be the saviors of these children. And then you get these teachers who really take these curriculums and take these approaches and these philosophies and really put it in a box. And children do not grow and learn in a box. And we need to help teachers understand that they need to adapt and adjust to the children that they are serving, whether they're low-income children or whether they're children that do have these high resources and parents have these high expectations and demands of the children. So we need to look at that holistic approach of how children learn and grow and help our teachers to understand that no matter what curriculum they're using, what philosophy they may adhere to, that they have to adapt to children's culture.
Okay, so let's go back to that. So many things are racing through my mind now based on this conversation. One is, of course, that in the 90s, I think, and even earlier, we had a number of African-American educators, Lisa Delpit comes to mind, who were really railing against the current progressive view of education, saying that it was imposed, in a sense, by white people, and I think she called her book Other People's Children.
Yes.
And she was really talking about, she was saying that, you know, these teachers had this liberal point of view that really didn't understand black culture. Now, you're also saying something about, I guess, are you saying that you have to be of the same culture? I mean, you know, that's a whole other issue. Do I have to be an African American to teach African American students,
not
or
at all.
Jewish to teach? You know, I mean,
No,
like,
not at all.
Okay, all right. So
No.
what are we saying here? Let's clarify that a
But
little
I
bit.
do think that I have more latitude as an African American teacher in terms of being a warm demander than I do as a white teacher.
Okay, why is that? Why is
I
that?
think I have to understand that the larger social and political context of race in America. And so I can be a warm demander. I can hold kids to high expectations. I don't want to love them into poverty. I may have to be more explicit about what the rules of the game are, because as one of my former colleagues who co-taught with me said, it's not about white, it's not about black, it's about green. And if I want to help people move out of poverty, the rules of the game, as Lisa Delpit points out, are essentially important to teach. So I get that.
Right.
But being a warm demander where I don't share the same background as the child or the family, I don't live in the community, I didn't grow up there, means I have to be incredibly sensitive about how I send messages. And as I say, what was jarring to me watching this video was this incredible mismatch.
Okay, so let's take this even another step, because I love, on EdCast, we recognize that these are complex issues and we take the time
Right.
to talk about them in a more
Exactly.
complex way. So I want to, this is also, however, begging another question, and that is the pedagogy of a no excuses school the proper pedagogy? Now, no excuses advocates will definitely point to the higher test scores that these schools have with minority children. Now, even adjusting to the decrease in scores that came as a result of aligning to the Common Core, where everybody's scores went down, including charters. Schools such as the Success Academy schools actually still did pretty well. So we have that other question of, is this the right pedagogy, and are there different pedagogies for different kinds of students? And I want to ask you about that. So is this the right pedagogy for these students?
I think that you have to look at the bigger picture. Now, when you're looking at the no excuses, you really are setting these parameters and you have this goal in mind, and it's more geared to their cognitive development.
In what way?
In the way that the curriculum is really outlined. Teach this on this day, give them these materials to work with on this day, and it's really scripted down to where the teacher says this child responds this way. If the child doesn't respond this way, teacher responds that way. It's really limited the teacher into their creativity, which also lends its way into not supporting the children's needs at that time, because not all children develop in the same way, nor are they going to respond to those quotes or that, you know, or anything in that way.
So the ripping up of the student paper was not as spontaneous, perhaps. That is something that you think teachers in that environment might do on other occasions?
It was an expectation.
Okay.
If the child did something wrong, this is the way you're supposed to respond. Not really giving that child an opportunity to explain why, or even giving that child the time, because the thought process, it takes them a little longer to process the information. So, you know, not even giving the child the time to really process the information where she could have answered the question. Again, when you do have these set parameters with this set sketch and this dialogue, that's what happens. And the teachers feel that pressure, and obviously that teacher felt that pressure because she went along with it, disregarding how the children was feel or how the other children
she's a mentor teacher,
and even
actually.
and even the way the other children may have reacted to the way she was treating that student. So in that regard, and again going back to what I said at the beginning, the environment that's created, and even going back to the question that you asked prior about, do you need to be an African American teacher to work with African American children? And I definitely don't agree with that, because you just have to be respectful and understand the culture. You don't have to live the culture, but you need to be respectful and understanding and knowing where they come from. And that's the foundation to really being a good teacher, really being responsive to children's and families' needs.
And one other characteristic of culturally responsive teachers is that they also know themselves. So it's not just knowing the kids and knowing, but it's being aware of how you're going to be perceived, what your biases are, what your background is, what your own educational biography is, and how it might be very different than the biographies that are going to play out in your classroom.
Now you prepare, both of you are in teacher education programs, and you are preparing our next generation of teachers. So how are you preparing them? I know teacher prep programs are getting criticism as well. We're being told they don't really adequately prepare teachers to step into the classroom. So what do you say to that, and what are some of the ways that your programs are trying to help teachers deal with, I think, is a very charged environment? What are you doing at Hunter and Atlanta?
First, in understanding what is expected of the teachers. A lot of teacher candidates come into programs with these idealistic views of what teaching is and what they're going to expect.
What do they come in thinking
They
think is idealistic?
They come in thinking that they really can make a difference, and they can make a difference, but it's how do they get to be able to make that difference? What is the atmosphere that's going to help them make that difference? Will they get the support to make that difference? Do they have the materials, the curriculum, the opportunities, the leadership to make those decisions where they can make a difference? And a lot of the teacher candidates come in not understanding the system itself and the different things that's in the system that may prevent them from being able to make a difference.
And what do you say?
So we deal with a very different population,
Right.
And I think that's an interesting contrast. So
In what way? Do you want to tell us?
Lehman students are almost all first generation. They are largely from the Bronx. They essentially, 65% of them speak English as a second language. They essentially are pragmatic and realistic, maybe not as idealistic in a sense. I've only been here for 5 years. My last 30 were spent teaching majority kids to work with majority pre-service candidates to teach minority kids.
So you've seen a shift now in that
for me,
Yep.
because now what I see is I see individuals who very much hit the ground running, who we need to inject with a bit more idealism, because they're very pragmatic. They know the system. And so in a sense, our programs complement one another, because the individuals who we serve at Lehman are not missionaries. And I used to refer to my students in my other institution, they're missionaries. Missionaries very quickly become disenchanted. So my students come with grit and persistence, a sense of reality. What we need to do is to give them a sense of what's possible and a sense of how things can be better, and how they can develop a sense of agency so that they are the leaders in schools to make those changes.
You know, there was a recent piece about someone, I really cannot remember his name, and he talked about how he became, I think, a mid-career teacher and how he was disillusioned and how it didn't work out and how he tried to make a difference and he couldn't. And a lot of the negative response to his story was that he was an educational tourist, you know, and that he came in almost, you know, thinking that he was going to make this big difference, and he shouldn't have. He should understand what it takes to be a really good teacher. So we see very high teacher turnover, especially in the New York City schools. I don't know, nationally I think there's high teacher turnover as well. What do your teacher ed programs look like then in terms of preparing students to go out and teach? Are they very different programs, the Hunter and the Lehman program? I mean,
our populations are very
population
different.
is
but the
different.
actual curriculum of getting ready to be a teacher, what might that look like? If people want to become a teacher, what would they go through?
Well, at Hunter, it's a clinically rich program, and I'm sure it's similar at Lehman.
You say clinically, you mean in the classroom?
And
Lots of
opportunities to practice. For me, because I'm in early childhood, but a lot of opportunities to observe children, to really document their developmental
Is
progression.
that new in terms of teacher prep pedagogy?
There's been a significant shift
sounds a little
towards
different to
clinical
me.
preparation.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you do the same at Lehman. So there's this new mentoring idea that teachers should have more time in the classroom before they actually take over the classroom. Do you see that happening more now?
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Now, what does this then say about accelerator teacher prep programs, something like Teach for America or the New York City Teaching Fellows?
We both have served the teaching fellows and will continue
Okay,
to serve.
so
It's not as though we're unfamiliar.
Okay, I know.
with it.
Okay, so how does that jive or play into what you think teacher preparation should be? Does it?
Again, if I had all the answers and I knew how to do it right, I would stand on a bully pulpit. We don't.
Okay.
So I think we need to look. We need to look and not judge. That's my whole approach to urban education. I try to encourage students to stop judging, faculty to stop judging, and to say, this is what is. What might it be, and how do we get there? So I'm hoping that we can make the best out of alternative preparation, provide people who elect to enter the profession through that gate with the best we possibly can, and then support them during that very difficult first year of teaching, and try to shape our coursework in more responsive ways to meet their needs.
Now, there's certainly the new study, data indicates that in some of our poorest neighborhoods, we have our least experienced teachers.
Yes.
All right, so what do you say about that? Is that something we should really be concerned about? What is the role of experience?
It definitely is something that we should be concerned about, but it's just the cycle, because as teachers get experience, they do want to move and work with a different population of students.
Meaning what? Meaning they want to stay where they are, or they want to
They
leave?
want to, because of the demands of working with the low socioeconomic neighborhoods. It's extremely exhausting, because you're just not working with the child, you're working with the family, you're working with the culture, you're working with the neighborhood and the impact that it has on the children, because they don't just come into the classroom ready to learn. You have to realize that they have other things that they're bringing, and you cannot ignore that, because that impacts how they learn and how they develop. So as a teacher, you need to understand that culture, you need to understand the community and what those children are bringing in. And it is exhausting, because it's daily. There are daily things happening that impact our children that teachers need to be aware of, so that they can adjust and adapt their teaching.
I know that's why they're pushing toward community-based schools, where there are a lot of social services that are brought right into school. We're going to run out of time soon, and I feel I want to ask you something that's on my mind all the time. Pre-K and kindergarten, are they becoming too academic? They sound they're way more academic than when I went to school. That I know for sure. What's your take on that? Are we giving kids enough time to play?
It's definitely a push down because of the pressure from the top down and the accountability and the expectations when you get to be of school age. In pre-kindergarten, there is a lot of emphasis on centers, on independent play, constructivism, children really being able to learn through their play, through their interactions, through their social skills.
Are you seeing that happening, that children learn
Again,
through play?
we're talking about leveling the playing field.
Okay.
Here. So when we talk about UPK programs, generally, again, much like the charter school movement, we're attempting to find ways to increase vocabulary, to increase pre-literacy and pre-numeracy skills, because if children come to kindergarten with an achievement gap between those who lived in poverty and those who lived in affluence, that gap only gets wider.
Right.
So I think, again, it's a ill-conceived sometimes approach, which lends itself to treating 3- and 4-year-olds like 8-year-olds, and that doesn't make sense. But I don't think it's, I don't think the intentions are awful. It's just that thinking about ways to create language-rich environments, numbers-rich environments, without trying to make 4-year-olds miniature 8-year-olds, that would be terrific. There are ways to do it in a play-based curriculum.
And we're talking about keeping it developmentally appropriate.
Exactly.
And what does that
children's
mean exactly?
learning.
When we use that phrase, developmentally appropriate, what do you mean by
When
that?
you talk about developmentally appropriate, what is the appropriate learning environment? What are the appropriate tools that's going to support the literacy development, the math development, the social-emotional development, the approaches to learning, just giving children that opportunity to be curious, to engage, to be a part of a community where they're not intimidated, where they're not afraid, where they take risk, where they experience, because it's about experience and exposure. That's what developmentally appropriate is. It's not a curriculum. They need to learn this on this day. Everything is about exposure, and that's what the low income, low socioeconomic status, and the low resource communities is lacking, those experiences and those exposures. So the more experiences and exposure they get in a developmentally appropriate environment, the more prepared they're going to be for kindergarten, and the more successful they're going to be moving up into
We're
elementary.
probably less than a minute left, so yes?
When I walk into a pre-K environment and I see children sitting at desks, essentially tracing letters.
Okay, what do you think of that?
That's an ill-conceived approach to getting pre-literacy skills.
What do you want to see when you walk into
I
that
want to
room?
see kids, I want to see centers where there may be plastic letters, where kids may be tracing letters in sand, where they're moving from that to playing with trucks and talking about imaginary opportunities that they've created for themselves. Because honestly, whether a kid knows that an A is an A when he or she walks into kindergarten is way less important than they have an opportunity to develop language, to use it, to hear it, and to connect it to experience.
Social skills. Kids need the opportunity to develop
It's
social
the
skills.
interactions.
We are completely out of time. This is such a great conversation, and I think we could have it for a lot longer, but unfortunately we are completely out of time. So I want to thank you both for joining us. Carmen Brown from Hunter College, Harriet Fayne, Lehman College, thank you again for being here. This was a really great conversation. Don't go away. We'll be right back with our Ed Bites. Welcome back to this edition of Ed Bites. According to a story in the Washington Post, gender may account for the languages people choose to study. The paper reports on a survey conducted by Babbel, a language learning website, which indicated that men prefer learning German, Portuguese, and Russian, while women favor Dutch, French, Italian, and Spanish. English and Norwegian were listed among the gender-neutral languages. In an earlier Ed Bite, we reported on the move to push back school start times for teens. Advocates of starting the school day later anticipated improvements in attendance, tardiness, and learning. TheJournal.com shared results of one New York school that started the day later. It reported fewer late students and improved discipline, but found no improvement in grades or physical and mental health. Researchers also found that later start times did not necessarily mean that students got more sleep. Before we go firing all those supposedly bad teachers, it may be best to remember that New York State is facing a severe teacher shortage. Recent numbers reveal that New York has nearly 13,000 fewer educators today than it did 5 years ago. The decline in teachers is largely attributed to the retirement of the baby boomer generation. But increased career options for women, coupled with the constant criticism of teachers, may also account for the dwindling core. Which country is the most literate? Not the United States. According to a study conducted at Central Connecticut State University, Finland ranks number 1, and the U.S. comes in at number 7. Nordic countries are among the most literate in the world. The study examined not only student test scores on international tests such as the PISA, but also looked at other variables associated with literate behavior, such as libraries, newspapers, and access to computers. That's it for this edition of EdCast. Till next time, class dismissed.